Well, excuse me, Dr. Robert Head, thank you for joining Steve Henderson and I today on the Great Lakes Civility Project. Glad to have you and glad to get this opportunity to speak. Is the retired president of both Rockford University and Urbana University, and the author of Winning from Behind, a new book. And he has also done a lot of work on anti-racism and how to get people to engage civilly and productively on that issue. So Dr. Head, welcome.
Thank you so much. So good to be with you today.
Okay, so when you talk about winning from behind in terms of this effort to combat racism, what is it you're talking about?
Just a slight correction. The book is entitled Playing from Behind.
Playing from behind. I'm sorry. Okay.
And it focuses on my early life, in which I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio during the turbulent civil rights era. Became the first in my family to attend college. Came from a lower class background, financially speaking. Public education. Found myself in a private majority liberal arts college, and sat there on the first day wondering, how do I get here? How did I get here? And how was I going to succeed? And with all the baggage that came with being an African American, not having a private school education, not coming from a family of means, how was I going to succeed? And what I discovered through those turbulent times was that being behind actually allows one to focus more, provided you more motivation, and gave you a strong catalyst to propel yourself into success. In fact,
yeah, go ahead.
In fact, there were a couple of Wharton professors who took the time to study several years of college basketball games. And they discovered that teams that were behind by 4 points or less, over 60% of the time, came back to win the game. And there was just something stellar about that. Teams that were behind by more than 4 points lost the game almost all the time. So if you're marginally behind, there is something that creates extra motivation. You maybe it's a fear of failure that causes one to succeed. So quite frankly, I wrote the book to inspire others who might consider themselves to be behind or disadvantaged to strive for success. And it identified 7 or 8 different life lessons that I learned that might help.
So how would you apply this book to the conversation that we're having right now, or the lessons that you learned to the conversation we're having right now in America, where it's not just that African Americans are behind, we are systemically behind, left behind, quite purposefully by centuries of inequality, and we continue to be pushed behind by policing, by systemic discrimination in housing and banking, all of these things that sort of mount into not just a disadvantage, but a fundamental disadvantage. What's your lesson for what we're seeing people in the streets about today?
Unfortunately, many of the conversations that we fail to have stem from a lack of a desire to communicate, a lack of an understanding on how we might communicate. And so several portions of my book deal with how we might foster appropriate communication to deal with getting to the heart of the most significant matters and working together to resolve them as a nation, as a community. I've always felt, I have no true documentation of this, but I've always felt that when I talk to even those folks I adamantly disagree with, that when we talk about values, the 80-20 rule does still apply. That 80% of the things that I want, 80% of the things that you want are almost identical. in terms of a place to worship, an opportunity to raise a family, to own a home, to get a great education. And then we find the 20% of the things that we disagree upon. If we can relate to each other on the basis of realizing that we agree more often than we disagree, then we might be able to have a civil conversation. You know, in my book, I point to an exercise that I use quite frequently when I'm talking about how we can communicate better. And the exercise is simply one of putting on a piece of paper the letters V and I, V and I. And I ask people to tell me how they can use a single straight line to make what they see on that piece of paper represent the number 7. And immediately people raise their hands and say, you put another straight line, making it another I, so it's a Roman numeral 7. You know, I then ask them to look at the next picture I give them, which is an I and an X. And I ask them to tell me how they can use a single line to make that represent the number 6. And more often than not, no hands are raised, no voices are heard, because they're perplexed. Well, the answer to the question is you just put an S in front of the I and the X. So it's a 6. But the reason that they are unable to give me the answer is because their frame of reference is Roman numerals.
Right.
They are so locked into that frame of reference that no other alternative, no other option is relevant. They can't think it through. So if we can get beyond the fact that we're all imperfect in terms of our knowledge base, that we all have deficiencies. In fact, that lesson is entitled Knowledge Can Be Limiting. What you think you know and what I think I know limits our ability to communicate. So to me, communication is the real key to breaking through these barriers and getting to the heart of an issue that I think are extremely important, but someone else might think is not so important or not so real.
Dr. Head, the first step Steve and I talk about when we're doing our civility sessions is the trust building, taking time to get to know the person you're conversing with and their values and their experiences. Do you concur that that's where it has to start, by building some knowledge and some trust of each other when you enter these difficult conversations?
Absolutely. In fact, one of my mentors, it's a gentleman by the name of David Cooperrider. You might have heard of David, or at least the Appreciative Inquiry process that he developed back in the late 1980s. But Appreciative Inquiry is a way of analyzing individuals, but particularly organizations, and using a much more positive approach to problem solving to generate creative solutions for organizations. So if you're familiar with team building and you hire a consultant to do team building, the first thing that a team building consultant will come in and do is talk to the group to find out what's wrong with the group and whose fault it is. Because that way they can create interventions of removing someone, changing someone's poor behavior. And what you find as a consultant when you use that technique is that people are very hesitant to talk. If you get them one-on-one, they're very quick to communicate how bad someone else is, but they're very, very hesitant to talk. Appreciative Inquiry uses a series of principles and processes. One is actually called the positive principle. And it says that if you can get to the heart of what is right with the group, when it was at its best, what roles did people serve while they were performing at their best, then you have an opportunity of building the strengths of the group and the individuals to then move into tackling a problem that might exist. So that's also a way of building trust, Nolan. I think it's the right approach for beginning the conversation and dialogue, and it's the only approach that can lead to sustained success with creative solutions.
You know, we also talk about the idea of, you know, how to listen and how listening is different when you are actually trying to listen to someone, as opposed to trying to sort of search for your next entry point in the conversation to talk, or thinking about the next thing that you might want to say. And we always say that's a really active thing to do. It's something you have to think about a lot when especially when you're in a conversation or an argument with somebody with whom you disagree. We tend to be in our own heads more than actually trying to take in what the other person is saying. I'm sure that is part of what you are trying to communicate here as well.
And that's a lesson that goes back almost 70 years for me now, because very early in life, my mother used the phrase, you can't learn anything with your mouth open. So as we communicate with one another, listening is as active as an activity as is speaking. And it's only during the listening part, that you're able to learn something.
Now, Dr. Head, I want to get back to that 80-20 proposition that you started with. How important is it for us to realize that we have much more in common than we have in difference?
It's through that dialogue, and for me, it's always through the opening venture. As we meet in groups or we meet one-on-one, as opposed to jumping into what's wrong, then we jump into some dialogue that brings us closer together in terms of what our interests might be outside of work or outside of the church, or whatever the case might be. It's just a matter of, again, an active engagement of understanding that we're not going to get to be able to overcome problems if we don't get to relationships first.
Talk to us about the role of activism in moving forward from the place we're now in as a country.
I happen to live in a community that is extraordinarily different than my political ideology. And that's okay. I'm managing through that. But so when I go to the fitness center or I go to the clubhouse, I hear a lot about activism that's going on in a very negative way. So I have a little bit of different response to that, which is that one must be active in sharing one's role and beliefs in what's going on in the world and what you want to overcome. But one also has to be truly engaged in a meaningful conversation to bring others to the light in terms of what you want them to learn. And that's extremely difficult in today's world, because I saw something a few weeks ago. It might have been as something as meaningless as being on Facebook, but it gave a comparison about how news is reported yesterday versus today. You know, the Walter Cronkites of the world would share with you what's going on in the world, and you're then able to make your own opinion about what you think about it. But our news outlets today have a viewpoint, and they tell you what's going on, but they also give you a thought process on what to think about it, not necessarily leaving it to you. So getting beyond that is probably a pay grade beyond me, but our news media, both liberal and conservative, are not doing us a real justice in getting behind the intellectual issues that are so very, very tough for us to overcome, and getting us together in that regard.
One of the other things that seems to me to be a mismatch right now is that the stakes on both sides are so different. And that for African Americans, for people of color in this country, these are fundamental liberties that we're talking about are being violated, and that we're saying enough. It's not going to happen anymore. For white Americans, the stakes aren't quite as high, and it's really difficult, I think, to bridge that gap when you are talking about solutions, when you are talking about activism, for instance. People saying, well, why are people upset? Why are they in the streets? Why are they doing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing? Well, it looks really different when the foot is on your neck. How do you bridge that? How do you erase that gap so that you can have a conversation of equals?
Yeah, that's gonna be a tough one to overcome. It's one I truly struggle with, because I always try to look at both sides. I always try to look at both sides. We have come from what I believe to be a society that in the past has worked towards win-win. We've never reached it, but we've worked towards win-win, and prevalently. And now it is more prevalent to work towards win-lose. So although African Americans would view that all the things that are going on are not allowing us to move towards true freedoms, and we know that to be the case, the majority, I won't say the majority, I'll say a great percentage of the majority view it as win-lose. If these things happen, then I lose something. And although they really don't lose a lot in terms of true freedom, there is a perception still that they are losing something. And that's the hard barrier to break. Loss of real freedom versus loss of some perceived privilege. I think some people are doing some great work in that regard. Excuse me for forgetting the author's name, but she wrote the book White Fragility. I think it's a great,
Sure.
it's a great book. And it tries to put in perspective of how that fragility, the loss of their perceived place in the world, can be counteracted. So to me, that's the issue.
Dr. Head, before we go, I want to ask you, we talk about the need for a national conversation on race, and we've been saying that for decades now. But it seems today we're afraid to have that conversation. How do you break down the fear and actually get people to start talking?
We have to separate the problem from the personal, and that's the struggle. That's a struggle. I sit on a board, and we had a tough conversation. It's a board of a university. We had a tough conversation with the board just a couple of weeks ago, and the attempt was, okay, if we are going to be an institution that continues to do well in recruiting minority students, and our minority students and their parents are concerned about what might happen on a predominantly white campus to their students. What do? How do we make this the most attractive college for African American students? And it begins with our understanding what their issues are, what their problems are. And so we have a conversation about racism. And the first thing we say is that I'm not calling you a racist. We have a conversation about racism. It's not personal. Don't take it personally. You might learn something, but don't take it personally. Try to understand the dilemma and how it affects those that get hit by it. And then how can we make our campus a better place for students? So for me, that's the answer almost all the way across the board. And I don't have the exact answer to how do we do that, but I think a part of it is how we frame the conversation. It's racism. It's not calling you a racist, and we're not here to be antagonistic. We're here to work on a national problem.
Dr. Robert Head, author of the book Playing from Behind, thank you for joining us today on the Great Lakes Civility Project.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you. We did.